we're going to be looking at the creation of common European data spaces, something that is a very hot topic, and we're hearing a lot coming out from the European Commission on that topic. And so it is fortunate that today we have several European Commission speakers on this panel, as well as academia represented. So, moderating the discussion, we are delighted to have Deputy Head of Unit for the Data Policy and Innovation Unit in DG-CNECT, Federico Milani from the European Commission. Federico, I know you're looking forward to a great discussion, so let me introduce to our audience your fellow panelists. Francesco Cartella is team leader and data scientist, also at the European Commission. Edward Curry is the Professor of Data Science and Director of the Insight of the SFI Research Centre for Data Analytics and Data Science and at the Data Science Institute at the University of Galway in Ireland. Philippe Gelin, we had speaking just earlier. Thank Philippe for staying with us, Head of the Sector on Multilingualism within DG-CNECT. And last but not least, Marc Schmidt, Policy Officer and Team Leader on eProcurement. Gentlemen, you're all very welcome. I know you have a lot of interesting topics to raise, and I know Federico is going to guide you through that, but just let me remind our audience, we will have time for questions. So scan that QR code or go to Slido and use Endorse 2023 to put your questions to our panelists. Start writing now, and Federico will come back to me and we'll have a general discussion before we wrap up today. So Federico, over to you. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And as Jennifer was saying, what we wanted to discuss on this panel is really the concept of data spaces. There are so many definitions of data spaces, and while we introduced the concept of data spaces in 2020 through the communication on the data strategy for Europe, by the Commission, there is a development on what is the concept, what is the objective of a data space. So what I would like to start is to have from Edward a definition of the data space. Since you are working also with the Data Spaces Support Center, how could you define in the most generic way a data space?
Thanks, Federico. So I think it's a great question. And I think what we've seen is that the data space keyword has kind of become an umbrella term to kind of capture what we see in terms of organizations wanting to share and exchange data and to figure out what's the best way to be able to enable that. If I was to try to break it down to its simplest terms, I would say that like a data space is an infrastructure, both technical and legal, that enables the exchange of data between different parties based on a clear data governance framework for those parties. So it's the technical side, it's the legal side, and it provides clarity for the framework. But I think it's really important to focus also on what a data space can enable. The purpose of the data space is much more important than the technical challenges that exist there. So data spaces can be created for different reasons, and they can create conditions between participants interested in collaborating, sharing data, exchanging data. And there's different purposes for which a data space can be created. So for example, these patterns of collaborations exist around the need for cost sharing, where organizations come together to share data because they see opportunities to be able to reduce the cost maybe of data management or of the supply chains that they're involved in or the business sectors that they're involved in. So looking at opportunities for organizations to share costs and reduce costs by collaborating in a data space. There's opportunities around joint innovation. You have scenarios where not all participants have all the data that's necessary to be competitive or to be able to create new products and solutions. So by coming together in a data space to share their data, organizations can create these new business opportunities for themselves, for their customers, through this sharing and exchange of data. You can have the notion of marketplaces, where again, not everyone has access to all the data, but by joining a data space, they can participate in maybe the acquisition and transactions around data so that they can basically come together to be able to share, purchase, and exchange data, all within a clear data governance framework that protects the data owner and the data subjects as well. And then you can also have other scenarios where you have data spaces that are targeting the common good, things like mobility data space, the Green Deal data space, where we're seeing we have these large challenges where data can be a solution to them. So for example, climate change, a data space in that area can support private and public organizations sharing information that can help support solutions to be able to reduce our climate footprint and to be able to have a more sustainable society. So I think it's really important to focus on the purpose, the value that we get from data spaces, and then to also look at the technologies and the regulation that actually secure and support the exchange of data in very clear ways.
Thanks, Ed. Now let's move a moment to two examples of data spaces where the Commission is taking almost a leading role in order to create it and to push the stakeholders to build this data space, because there is a clear advantages for the citizens, and therefore the Commission still believes that there has been a need to push for the creation of this data space. And the first data space that we are talking about is the language data space with Philippe. Philippe, can you tell us about the language data space and what is its objective and who is targeting the data?
It's the target is pretty open first, but what it is about, it is really about supporting the exchange of language data, and language data is used for various topics, but one obvious one is actually creating AI tools and AI services to be deployed. And on that angle, the European Union has a specific angle, first to ensure there is a matter of sovereignty here in order to ensure that it will deploy the AI tools which are really needed, the natural language processing exercise. But there is another angle as well, which is the language coverage. Language data basically is half of the data exchange in the internet, but actually 90% of them is, well, no, not 90% of them, I'm shooting too high here, but at least 80% of it is English. Wherever in Europe, well, surprisingly, it's not only English that we're speaking around. Luckily, that's part of our digital and cultural diversity exercise. So we need to favor the presence of the other languages in this example. So that's basically one of the angle and specificity of what, and the reason why the Commission is really pushing this language data space. So matter of cultural diversity, but also a matter of competitiveness in this exercise.
Thanks, Philippe. And now let's move to the other example. And here I've got Marc Christopher, that is one of the responsible for the deployment and the development of the public procurement data space. We already know, most of us knows that there are already portal, platform, whatever you want to call it, that provide information about public procurement. But why do we need then a public procurement data space? Marc Christopher.
Federico, I prepared a small slide set to make it a little bit more visual to show the importance of the public procurement data space. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that. Next slide. Thank you. We will see that roughly 250,000 public buyers are spending each year roughly 2 trillion euros with taxpayers' monies. The 2 trillion euros are roughly 13.6% of GDP. So public buyers have a massive buying power, and they are necessary so that we have the basic infrastructure, for example, the roads that we drive on, the hospitals that we have to go to if necessary, the education, energy, social protection. So public procurement covers a lot of areas that are essential for the European Union to be more resilient, to be more sovereign. But unfortunately, we are not able to really use this power of this information to make good policies. We have, when public buyers publish notices, we have the TED platform. The TED stands for Tenders Electronic Dailies. So public buyers have to, above a certain threshold, publish notices on TED. And this roughly makes 20% of the data available on public procurement procedures. And the rest is hidden in member states' data sources, sometimes even fragmented. So if we go to the next slide, we see that what we can do actually when we are able to harness the power. So we have here 6 blocks. The first one is targeting public funds towards policy priorities. For example, the Green Deal. We currently have not a good understanding on how public buyers use taxpayers' money to invest into the Green Deal. We want to help to understand to the recovery of the European Union after the COVID. We have set up this Recover and Resilient funds. And with the coming notifications, we will be able to track how this public money is actually spent to help to recover the EU. The public procurement data space will also help in increasing transparency and integrity. We will connect it to other databases so that we can see potential collusion in public procurement procedures. We will be able to see in the future in a better way if who is the owner of a company. Is it, let's say, a Russian company that are currently under sanctions? Then we want to provide with the public procurement data space as well an easier access to suppliers. So we have on TED already a lot of information to find business opportunities, but we want to make it easier for public suppliers to find business opportunities, and especially SMEs, because we have a broader range of information available. We want with the public procurement data space to get better value for money, because that is more or less what is required when we use taxpayers' monies to have good value for money. And when I said this example of buying green, for example, this is currently done in silos, and with the public procurement data space, we want to provide public buyers a tool where they are able to see when they procure something, how did other buyers do it? Could they even participate? Could they buy in bulk? So we want to provide a tool with the PPDS for this as well. And then, of course, generally creating more key insights on how the single market works. For example, we will be able to see what kind of procedures are used to buy specific goods. Does it work well? Does it work not so well? And then with this information, we'll be able to divert or to adjust the policies so that the public buyers can buy more efficiently, or that we are able to see how can we attract public business opportunities for SMEs to participate easier. So the public procurement data space will be able to cover all these broad ranges of topics. In the next slide, we see very basically on how the public procurement data space works. We have a federated system. The system will be in a federated approach, meaning that we have at the center the public procurement data space. We want to connect the national publication portals to the public procurement data space. We have set up new notifications to have more data, better data. And as the slide depicts, that there will be a common data format, which is very important. It was developed by the Publications Office together with a community all over Europe, is that we will use actually linked data. So the data that is available on the side of the member states on notices, we will have in the end as linked data, which we'll be able to process in a better way. We want, of course, to provide a very user-friendly internet access to this information. We'll provide a website, and from there, the different users, public buyers, policymakers, SMEs, citizens, or NGOs, that they can more easily see what is relevant for them, that they can have access to it. We'll provide on the top of the data analytic tools that can be used to see new insights, to help us to make data-driven decisions, which is more and more important. There will be a lot of KPIs that we will use to identify how do the different member states perform, what are the issues, what can be improved, what works well. And in the, I think it's already the last slide. This is the roadmap of the implementation. So this year is mainly about setting up the basic public procurement data space to connect it to the TED database, so that we have already the information available for above the EU thresholds. And then we will prepare, of course, the PPDS already this year, so that in the next year we will be able to connect the national portals from the member states to the public procurement data space. And then roughly in 2025, we will extend the scope of the public procurement data space, not to consider only notices, but also other data, something maybe like invoices or other information that will be necessary to have more insights. That is it from my side. With this, I would hand the floor back to Federico.
Thanks, Marc. And then I've got Francesco. So, Francesco, you're working with Marc on the implementation, basically, of the public procurement data space. So, can you tell us a bit more what are the main technical challenges that need to be addressed for building this specific data space?
Thank you very much, Federico. I think it's a great question, and well, I think that's so much to say. Before starting on the technical challenges, I actually prepared a small presentation well, of our involvement within the data space. So if we can go to the next slide. Let me tell you that actually I represent my Directorate General, which is the Directorate General for Informatics, the DG-CNECT, in particular the Unit B1 data service, and I belong to the Sector 001, which is the sector in charge of dealing with data, information, and knowledge management. Actually, our goal here is a support role for DG Growth, so in particular with Marc Christopher, indeed in the implementation of the public procurement data space. So we are indeed supporting under the technical point of view that the public procurement data space is implemented. And it's actually an initiative that is very relevant for us, because DG-CNECT will be one of the main actors in offering technical digital solutions to the different data spaces that are under development and managed by the European Commission. So obviously PPDS is one of those. If we go to the next slide, our role essentially is mainly to ensure a proper implementation of the PPDS concerning several factors, most importantly technical aspects. We are data units, so we need to ensure that everything is implemented properly, also under the data aspects, but also taking into account the latest infrastructure and technologies. As well as, I think, a very important role that we have also in this implementation is also ensure a coordinated approach with all the other, I would say, horizontal activities that are going on in the field of data spaces. So we have in the panel today, Edward from Data Space Support Center. We have Philippe from the language data space. So we need basically to ensure a coordinated approach and wide approach all over the initiative. So I'm thinking about also the simple, which is the small middleware that is being procured in this days. So that's actually our role in this, I would say, joint effort with DG Grow. Let me tell you also something about, in particular, about the public procurement data space. If we go to the next slide. Essentially, well, I think we will have the opportunity to talk a little bit more in details about it, but the public procurement data space will be implemented based, I would say, on several pillars. Well, we have the interoperability, which I would say is one of the most important, because as I said, we need to somehow collaborate with all the other initiatives. So basically, there is going to be a huge effort for data integration. There is everything around the trust aspect, so everything related to security, to trust, to privacy, access management, data ownership. So that's all, I would say, concept that needs to be taken into account. There is also the data value, which is, I would say, one of the most core objective of PPDS in particular, and all the data space initiatives are aiming actually at a data economy, at an enhanced access to information. And of course, one of the main objectives is also to provide a successful user experience. And essentially, in order to ensure the business and digital continuity of the PPDS, basically these pillars needs to be based on a sound governance vision. If we go to the next slide, is going to be the conclusive one of this introductory presentation. Basically, this slide presents a little bit, well, extend a little bit what Marc Christopher just presented in his last slide. Is the, I would say, the roadmap, the tentative roadmap for the PPDS implementation. So as you can see, is an initiative that will be run in a time span of around 1 year and a half. Just started February 23, so less than 1 month ago. And basically it will be released in consecutive phases. So we will start with a high-level prototype with, I would say, the most important functionality to be demonstrated. Then there is going to be a pilot version and a final scale-up version. It's very important to highlight the fact that the main difference between the releases, let's call it like this, will be both in terms of functionality of the data space. So I'm thinking about maybe, I would say, enhanced analytical layers, but also, as Marc Christopher was saying before, the main difference will be also in the data. So there is going to be, I would say, a progressive and increasing involvement from different stakeholders. So we'll start with TED data, but there will be member states that will be more and more involved on the scale-up version. So now I can come back to your initial question. What are the technical challenges of the data space? Well, I think, as I said, it's a $1 million question, because let me first say that it's a very ambitious and pioneering initiatives. Actually, I'm relatively new to the institution. I spent all my careers as a university researcher in private companies, as a data scientist, working mainly for AI and machine learning project. And I must admit that one of the common denominator in all the activity I did is basically was the lack of data, the lack of quality data. So when I joined the European Commission, I was glad to hear that I would have been involved in the materialization of this vision of the data spaces. And also, conscious of the fact that I was going to solve one of the most crucial problem in, I would say, industrial and academic world out there. Actually, there are many technical challenges, and as I think Philippe was saying before, the challenges are not only technical but legal and bureaucratic. There is a lot of, let's say, of facing here. But talking about the particular technical challenge I mentioned before, interoperability. So I think the main functionality of a data space is really to integrate data that come from different sources, and they come from different levels. So within the data space, but among other data spaces. And it's very important at the technical level to ensure the adoption of open standards. Then another challenge is really at the semantic level. Basically, it's important to transmit the importance of using reference data. So basically adopt at the semantic level the same lexicon, the same, I would say, in terms of vocabulary, taxonomies, ontologies. So the adoption of this, of all of these techniques, such that we basically call the things in the same way. Another big challenge is data quality. I think it has been mentioned before, and well, it's a big challenge, but it's essential to ensure the data flows between different data sources. And it's fundamental, in my opinion, to create value and knowledge. So it's also a big challenge to invest in the data quality feedback loop. Then another challenge that I see is really modularity. Actually, we need to envisage a coordinated approach with other initiatives of the data space. And given that we are a kind of pioneer in this field, actually, we need to keep a high level of flexibility. So we need basically to be ready to accommodate standards and protocols that basically could be adopted a posteriori. So I mentioned before the simple, for example. And so at this, under this perspective, is, in my opinion, fundamental to adopt open standard again, and being technology agnostic in order to not be too much bounded or constrained to a specific technology. Then there is the big chapter of trust, security, and privacy. So essentially, it's very important. It's a big challenge to guarantee a full control of the data to the data owner. So to manage and setting proper permission. Especially, I'm thinking in the case where there is cloud provider, external cloud provider involved. So there is going to be a lot of problem in managing the permission, trying to understand the physical location of the data and all the related aspects. Then, of course, privacy is a big issue, but in my opinion, it's something that it doesn't, I would say, stay only with data. So if I remember correctly, Edward mentioned that data space is going to enable a lot of new technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning. Well, I think all this type of application, every service that is plugged with data space should be somehow privacy preserving. There is a lot of I would say novel research going on about the possibility of, for example, machine learning models to leak data, to leak information. So I think it's a challenge that it's needed to be faced. Another challenge is more under the technical point of view, I would say, to guarantee performance. Actually, it's crucial that a proper scalability of the infrastructure is guaranteed, because we need to, I would say, foresee also period where there is a lot of load, there is a lot of requests. So the scalability of the infrastructure is very important. Finally, I would say that there is another challenge is to guarantee the data accessibility from multiple entry points. Of course, we need to forecast different type of users. There is going to be the more, I would say, low-level user that could access from a web interface. There might be the most, I would say, advanced user that would have access to the data from an API. And of course, we need basically to make sure that the access of the data will be continuous, will be guaranteed, and especially, from a high-level user perspective, we need to guarantee a good user experience, usability, and user friendliness of the application. Finally, I would say as a last point that I would like to mention is really a good level of customization of the data space. So I would say that it should be possible from everybody to plug their own application. I'm thinking about machine learning and artificial intelligence model for fraud detection in the public procurement data space. That's something that we need to enable. So just to conclude, this is, I would say, the challenge that we see at the current moment. But of course, there is going to be much more as soon as we start developing, and most importantly, as soon as the data space will be live, let's say, exposed to the public.
So one thing that comes to my mind is also I would like also to hear the opinion of Philippe on which are the challenges of starting a language data space, but not only the technical one. I'm always curious to know how you manage to convince stakeholders to join in and provide their data.
Yes. Actually, in terms of challenges, Francesco has been reasonably thorough in all the different angles. But indeed, Federico, there is an angle on more the psychological aspect. You know, when you talk about data sets and data ownership, we have seen in the previous, you know, it's about 15 years that we are collecting data. Usually when I explain to the people, you know, data sets, it's my precious, you know. I've spent years and years to collect it. I just do not want to surrender it. And on that aspect, how we manage to convince the people, and you can take one example, and not to say that this sector is greedy or whatever, but very nice example on the publishing industry. Very sensitive on the copyright and freeing the things. We were trying to explain them that's actually a second life for the data. So you have the market exercise. So you sell a book. The book, the edition and the like provide you a return on investment and the like. So you've got that. But you have a tremendous amount of data that can be reused for other purposes. So ensure that you keep the ownership, you keep the right and control on the data, but you can also provide a second life of it. So in generating another stream of revenue related to that. So it's more the psychological aspect, which is very important. So to ensure that the framework, and that's what the European Union is about, and the digital strategy is about, data strategy is about, is to ensure that all the constraints, all the legal aspects are really put in place so that the people can share the data in confidence. And honestly, it has not been the case for the last 20 years. And it's really what the European Union, the European Commission tried to establish, really a true market exercise where people can deal with it.
Thanks, Philippe. Edward, you are part, as I was saying, of the Data Spaces Support Center that is looking also to data spaces and initiatives that are generated by the stakeholders themselves. So what is your experiences? How do you plan to support the creation of the data spaces? Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Thanks, Federico. So I'll break that into two parts. I'll just maybe comment on some of the challenges that have been mentioned so far and some of the experiences that we've seen. And then the second part, I'll talk a little bit more about the DSSC in particular and what it's planning to do to try to address these. I think Francesco has done a really good job, and the other panel members have done a really good job of highlighting the challenges that we face here. What we're trying to do with data spaces, it's a very important problem, and it's a tough nut that we've been trying to crack for a long time. It's large, it's complex, and if we get it right, it's going to have a game-changing disruption because it is a moonshot, we'll say, in the data space. But it does come up with these many fundamental challenges, and we see this across different data spaces and different communities that are coming together to work on the data sharing initiatives. So you're seeing many fundamental technical challenges, organizational challenges, legal challenges, commercial challenges that exist in trying to develop and deploy the data spaces. I think one of the absolute key challenges that exist there is around data quality. And that is a very broad challenge because what we're trying to do with this data is make important decisions, is to make societal changing decisions as well. And when you look at the experience that we have in data-driven innovation, and particularly now within AI-driven projects that are using data, what you see is that the costs that go into these projects for the data preparation is very high. Anything from 40 to 80% of the project, depending on the studies that you look at, is actually going into that data preparation phase. And then many of those projects do fail purely because the data is not of sufficient quality to make the important decisions or the business critical decisions or society critical decisions that need to be made. And that's where the data space initiative is trying to step into that. We're trying to step in there and say, how do we reduce those costs? How do we make it easier for people within the community, within the data space to be able to reuse that data once they've invested the time and energy to make it of high quality, to be able to make those decisions. So I think it's a big challenge that we face. And the only way that we'll do that is by working together, by bringing the expertise together from many different communities, by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's exactly where the Data Space Support Centre comes in. What we want to do is to look to work with individuals and organizations that want to establish data spaces, to be able to kind of share experiences between those communities, to work with those communities to try to build consensus. But consensus does take time. It's not something that's simple. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that needs to be developed and to be nurtured, and there needs to be trust between the different communities as well, whether you're looking at this from a technical point of view or from a legal point of view. What the Data Space Support Centre wants to be is that go-to place where communities come to find out about data spaces and the challenges that they do. We want to create blueprints for how data spaces look from a design point of view, to create building blocks, to look at toolboxes, to look at design principles. But we're not going to create all that by ourselves. It'll be created through a community of practice. And that is one of the key things that we're doing, is creating that community of practice where we can bring together data space designers, data producers, consumers, organizations that want to run data spaces or provide services into data spaces, and to bring them into working groups where they can try to tackle these challenges together, learn from the lessons that we've learned from the past, and then work together towards building the new infrastructure that we need for data spaces. So it's very much about creating a co-creation process with the communities, working with the different communities, and recognizing that a procurement data space will look different to a language data space. There are opportunities, there's lessons that both can learn from one another, but that fundamentally they may have different designs and different technologies. The challenge becomes, how do we ensure interoperability? How do we ensure that the procurement and language are not don't become silos that don't talk? So that looks very much on the challenge of standardization, whether it's through official means or through de facto means, looking at the notion of compatibility between data spaces, and understanding how we can build those create those standards, build those de facto standards, and get organizations and communities talking and working together to share experiences. So there's a lot of challenges that go with that. I think the other thing that's important when we think about data spaces and the design of them is thinking of the work that went in the scientific community at looking at FAIR data, because I think that FAIR gives us a very kind of clear set of principles about how we want to be able to design and to work with data. And if people aren't familiar with FAIR, it's about creating data that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So this is a good place for us to start, and that might look different for different data spaces depending on the technologies that they want to use and to work with. So from a data space support center's point of view, we're very much thinking of this from an implementation agnostic point of view. We're not trying to identify a single vendor or a single technology that solves everything, but very much looking at what's the functionality that we need, what are the lessons that we can learn, how do we encourage interoperability, what kind of standardization is needed, what gaps are potentially there in the standardization world where we can actually step in and try to bring the community together to identify the best practices and what should be standardized there. So I think that kind of gives you a quick overview of what we're doing. The key thing I want to mention is that next week as well, the Data Space Support Centre has a data space symposium that's taking place, which is one of these first events to bring this community together, the community of practice, and to mobilize us as a collective to be able to tackle this problem.
Thanks, Edward. Then I wanted to go back to Mark Christopher and asking, since Edward was talking about interoperability, I don't think that the data space of public procurement would want to be a standalone system. So are you already planning to use or to connect with other data spaces, provide data or access data? For example, are you going to linking, or are you going to provide translation of the various procurements?
Yes.
So having a link with the language data space.
What we will definitely do is we will provide the translations because we see that because we have so many languages in Europe, to make the data more accessible, it is important to provide the information in the language of the one who actually uses the data. So that, for example, if I give an example, if a Dutch is buying something in green, that a German buyer can see how in Dutch they have done it, but in their own language. So definitely this will be a very important aspect to translate the information that is available in the public procurement data space. But we will also connect it to other data space. We have been in touch with also with FISMA about the financial database. The Green Deal will be very relevant for us. The health data space. So public procurement is a very horizontal data space that it touches upon different many sectors, as I showed in the beginning of the presentation. Therefore, the key and to make more value out of the public procurement data space is actually to connect it to other data sources as well.
Thanks, Marc. And I think now we can also ask some question from the audience. So Jennifer, have we got any questions?
Thank you very much, Federico. We do indeed. We've got quite a few questions coming in to our panelists. Not everyone has been allocated, so I'm going to just ask you to sort of raise your hand and jump in if you want to answer it. So the first question is, how do we mitigate the risk that data spaces develop into silos? Is this about top-level coordination? Who wants to tackle that?
Edward, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a combination of both. I believe what we need to have is top-level coordination, but also ensure that when we're coming from the bottom up, that we're educating our communities of practice to start thinking about sharing and interoperability of their data at a very early stage. So I think that's a critical part of it. I think the Commission is stepping in to provide that top-level coordination. It's set out the vision for the data spaces. It's put in the preparatory actions across the different sectors. It has the data space support center that's trying to connect those to make sure that there's lessons and exchange of communication between those different initiatives. And what we need to do now is to engage with the practitioners that are building data spaces. And as we're creating these and designing these, always be thinking about how do we make it easier to share data? How do we make it easier to be interoperable between the different spaces, the different data spaces? So hopefully we will build this in from the ground up. Obviously, it's going to be incremental. It's not going to be full interoperability from day one, but the important thing is that we're always thinking about how do we make our data more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and what does that look like for the data space that we're working in for the different communities.
Marc, Christophe,
I could actually
yes.
add something on this interoperability, because we see that on the Open Data Portal, we provide open data on public procurement data, and it's one of the most used data sets in Europe for research and for various topics. So of course it is our interest to provide the data as much as possible in an accessible way or interoperable way, so that we see that how the data can be reused. It is, and that I think is very important as well to say, is a data space does not mean that per se all the data will be open, because we might have information that is sensitive. So, and it is as well, and that is one of the concepts of the data spaces, that the data providers, they have sovereignty of the data. So they can decide of what can we do with the data. So it's not just on us to say what we can do, but it's also on, let's say, the member states who share the data, that they have a say, of course, there.
And then probably also Francesco can tell us a bit more about what Digit is doing, because they've already developed over the years building blocks that could be useful to create a data space. I'm referring to the eID, for example, or the e-delivery, that are building blocks that can be used. Isn't it, Francesco?
That's correct. I think it's one of the, I would say, architectural decisions that we will take in the I would say in the course of the development of the PPDS. So linking to what I said before, the fact that the PPDS needs to be modular as possible, not linked too much with I would say with a specific vendor. I think that the direction is going to be indeed to use I would say predefined building blocks that potentially have been already implemented, that basically what you mentioned, Federico, is already considered in the pipeline toward the implementation, in particular the architecture of the PPDS.
Thanks. Jennifer, back to you.
Yeah, so another question we have coming in is talking about vocabulary hubs as the backbone for the construction of data spaces. Is the EU considering the same? What is the EU perspective on this?
So, Marc, but then I think also Edward can talk about it.
So the Publications Office is actually in developing the eProcurement ontology, which we are using to harmonize the data in the public procurement data space. They started already many years ago, and if it would not be for them and the community that they set up, it would have been very, very difficult to implement the public procurement data space. And what is part of this data spaces as well is that we have vocabularies behind it. So, and Francesco said this in his presentation, that you need to have reference data. And with the support of the Publications Office, we actually have a lot of vocabulary that we can just reuse to help that we have good data in the solution.
And there, Edward, vocabularies means going really sectorial, isn't it? So the vocabulary used by specific data space can be different from another one. So how do you assure that the two data spaces can talk to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the notion of a vocabulary hub is very central, but it's not the hub that's central. It's what it represents. If you have a vocabulary that's accepted by a community around a data space, that means there's consensus. And we don't always have consensus within our communities. And one of the major steps that we'll have to take within our different data space initiatives is to start to build and to create that consensus. So the hub is potentially a tool that helps us drive that community process, to give transparency and about how consensus is driven around, created around a vocabulary, and that becomes critical. Once you have vocabularies in different communities, then you have effectively a meta process, a need to be able to understand, well, what's similar in data space A or in vocabulary A, and what's similar in vocabulary B from another community. So again, you have a community process that's need to be driven to ensure that we can start to link and to connect vocabularies from different data spaces. I think it's also important to think about this notion of data integration versus the concept of data linkage, because they're not the same thing. Data integration kind of assumes that you've got full alignment between two vocabularies and that there's full consensus with it. The notion of data linking allows us to be able to link things together and to build consensus incrementally. So we don't necessarily need to have full alignment or full agreement from day one before we have that integration. So I think the leveraging of technologies like linked data, looking at vocabularies, seeing where commonality exists, quickly agreeing that, and then figuring out how do we put in the processes to incrementally grow and achieve more consensus over time. Because if we're waiting for full consensus across all our vocabularies, across all our data spaces, we'll be here for a long time waiting for that. So it's how do we leverage the technologies to quickly connect and show where associated and related data is there, and then incrementally try to build and grow consensus over time using things like vocabulary hubs and other processes that can control the community consensus and can help us with the workflow of that.
I have another two questions in related to this same point, and both referencing the public procurement data space. So one asking, how do you see the use of semantic technologies and linked data within that space? And another asking, well, since the public procurement data space interacts with the other domains, doesn't that mean that having a horizontal approach is better? I think it's building on what you've already been saying. Does anyone else want to take up those points?
Marc? Yeah.
Yeah. On the horizontal approach, we of course start based on the procurement ontology to set up the data space. The vocabulary that we will use as well is partially not only can be used for our data space, but also for the other one for other data spaces. But then when it comes to use of semantic linked data technology, it started actually already in 2010, or 2011, that the first ideas to implement linked data for public procurement notices to make the information much more accessible. And it took quite a long time to come to this time where we are able to actually implement a data space using linked data. Linked data has the advantage that data can be directly accessible. We, for example, linked in the proof of concept the public procurement data space to another linked data set, to the Cohesio database. And from there, we were able very simply to link it to Wikidata, which is provided as well as linked data. So using semantic technology has the advantage that you can much more easily link data sets together. If you have something like raw data, CSV files, etc., it will make the data much less approachable. That is one experience that we already made in the short period of time while implementing the public procurement data space.
Another couple of questions that are coming in are on the user experience. So to quote our audience members, are data spaces mainly for organizations to cooperate, or is there also a user perspective? And how is user friendliness enhanced within a data space? How can a successful user experience be ensured? What is the benefit for users? Anyone want to talk about that user perspective?
Francesco, or then Edward, and also Philippe. I think he's got his.
Yeah, Philippe.
Yeah, let me quickly comment on this. I think that's more a question for Marc Christopher, but I think to answer the question, data space is basically for everybody. So we are at the current moment, we are basically identifying the users group. Let's put it like this. And honestly, I think it's very wide type of user. Of course, I think as I quickly mentioned in my intervention before, one of the main challenge would be really to provide the right level of access to the right user. So I imagine that data space can be accessible, for example, by citizen, for example. So my mother, so she would be able to access the public procurement data space in I would say, in a commensurated type of level of access. Of course, there is going to be universities, there is going to be more expert user that would need a more, I would say, detailed level of access, so via API, so they can deploy and develop their own application. It's going to be a big challenge, in my point of view, to give it, as I said before, the right level of access to the right user. I don't know, Marc Christopher, if you want to.
Well, Francesco, just as you were speaking, another comment came in asking about whether we should consider private actors as creators in this space. So I think you've already even raised that. Philippe, you're nodding along. Did you want to add anything, or Marc Christopher?
Because I think that, again, the language space, it's more focusing, from what I understood, is more focusing to stakeholders, to companies that are using the data. Or are you also providing tools for the citizen, for example, for helping them?
Yes, but maybe for the first question, the profiling and the user, it's really essential. If you want it to be a success, you have to understand the needs of the users, the need of the provider, the need of the actors of the platforms, and that's really essential. For us, we see different type, being the academics, the SMEs, being the administration exercise, the people that are knowledgeable, the people that are not knowledgeable, and being able to define the different use case is an essential aspect. And that's where we come back to say that actually it's a business development exercise. You need to ensure the loop, you need to track the needs, you need to track the requests from the other type of population, and it's really essential. If you want it to be a success, you have to be really open-minded and hear the request. Now, the language data space is also providing services, and one of these example is actually everything that has been done under the e-translation, what we call now e-lang tech, because it's go beyond the translation. We also provide pseudo-anonymization, we provide clusterization, we provide speech transcription exercise that now not only is provided to the institution, but also to the SME, to the overall public administration, the NGOs and the academia. So we have a multiple set of actors here, and it's a business exercise where we need to comply with all of the different needs and services. And that's what make this challenge really getting broader than the business as usual for these actors.
Thanks. Edward, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, if I could just share some experiences that we had with some data spaces and smart communities. I think it's important that people, so a data space is about the data, but the reason we're bringing all this data together is to build applications and services on top of it. So it's really those applications and services that allow us to target different user groups. So a really good example of this is we were involved in a data space for a smart community that was collecting water and energy usage for the different households that were there. So this was a data space, we had interoperability, we had real-time data flowing through it. And what we had is effectively a large data catalog where a data engineer or data scientist could go and find those data sets. And that's perfect for them. They're quite happy there. It's nice, fair data, nicely marked up, reusable, fantastic. But we also have other users in that data space that are interested in that data. We have parents that are running a household and they want to understand, well, what's my energy usage here? They don't want to go to a data catalog to find that. What they want is a dashboard, an application that takes that data and presents it to them to say, this is your energy usage. Are you doing better or worse than potentially people beside you? What are the energy saving opportunities that you have? At the same time, you have children possibly in those households as well, and they want to see information about what their energy and water usage is. It's not the same, it's not presented the same way that it is for the parents. Parents are probably interested in how many euros does it cost, but for the kids, and the young adults, they're probably interested in other aspects such as the environmental impact of it, or what do their activities have in terms of cost. At the same time, you might have research scientists that are looking at trying to study communities and how they use data, and they'll want to have much more interactive scientific dashboards about the aggregate usage across all of the different households. So the key thing here is that in order to extract the value from these data spaces, we need to think about what are the applications, what are the AI-based services that we have on top of this, and then targeting those to the specific users that we're trying to meet. And that's very much going back to the traditional kind of software engineering approaches about how you build an application to make sure that it meets the needs of the target groups that you're working with. So I think that's the beauty of the data space, is that a single data space can power all of those different applications by going to a single source to be able to retrieve that data and to work with it.
Mark, Christopher, probably this is the same thought that you are doing by developing the data analytics on the data that you are collecting.
Yes, we are setting up currently focus groups to with the users who would in the end use the public procurement data space, so policymakers, public buyers, SMEs, but also NGOs, to understand their needs and how they would perceive, how they want to use the data from the public procurement data space. I think this is very important. It's actually what Ed was said to say, you have others just want to get the data to use it in their own applications. A family who wants to know how is my community spending money, they want to have different information than others who want to, more SMEs, for example. So I think it is important to see what are the needs of the actual users.
Well, one of our audience members has said we should speak more about collaboration. Should we speak more about collaboration when we say data spaces? I think that's almost a rhetorical question, because I'm sure you're all going to agree that it is about collaboration. Another question that has come in is about vocabularies, and many vocabularies are horizontal. But how do we drive the consensus for vocabularies that have different implications across sectors? Who would like to take on that one? Francesco, you're...
Edward probably, and the
Edward.
work that you are doing with
Yep.
the data space support center. Even if it's just starting, so probably you are at the beginning of this work, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an interesting phrasing for the question, because if you're driving adoption of a vocabulary that's trying to get consensus across multiple sectors, that seems to me potentially not to be the way to try to do that. I think it's maybe put it the other way. How do you bring those communities together to build consensus so that they're happy to adopt the implications of that vocabulary, or at least for them to understand it? Because I think, and it was mentioned before, a lot of these things about interoperability, we think of them in technical terms, but really the interoperability that needs to take place is the consensus at the individual level, at the company level, at the community level. And that's the part that we have to drive. So I would suggest that we'll be trying to build consensus and to make different communities aware of what vocabularies are available, how they could be used inside their sectors, and obviously they may have alternatives or maybe variations of that where they specialize it to make it more specific for their particular sector. But I think the key for us will be trying to drive the consensus as opposed to drive adoption. So much more carrot and less stick, I would suggest.
At least we can store them in the language data space. At minimum.
Provide also translation in the various languages.
Indeed, we should be able. Even though it's a difficult exercise.
Yeah. To come back to some of the discussion that was happening earlier, we have another question in where our audience members commenting that interoperability, quality and modularity were all listed as major issues, but are they all really on the same level? I think to come back to what you were saying, interoperability looks like the most serious objective. Is that fair to say? Marc, Christopher, anyone? Yeah.
Personally, I think when I would speak for the public procurement data space, I would say interoperability is probably not the biggest issue. Because if we are able to provide the information as linked data, then it will be really easy to connect to this data space. I think, and Francesco, I think he will agree with me, it will be the data quality. In order to provide good analytics, we need to have a good data quality in the procurement notices, and we see already now that we are lacking sometimes the data quality. It really depends on the country, it depends on the, let's say, maybe even which solution they are using, but we see that the data quality sometimes really lacks a lot of information, which makes it very difficult to provide the purpose of the public procurement data space, to have good analytics, to have new insights, or to understand how public procurement is done. So I think one of the issues that we will provide with the public procurement data space, or one thing that we will provide with the public procurement data space, is a quality dashboard for the member states, so that they actually can see how good or how bad is the data that we receive from their country. And it is not something that will change from one day to the other. I think it will be a longer process for the coming years to help to improve the data overall. So but for me, that is the biggest issue.
Thanks, Marc. But then I've got a question for Philippe then. From his perspective, is it better no data or bad quality data?
The answer is implied in the question. I prefer bad quality than no data at all. That being said, from a scientific point of view, bigger is not necessarily better as well. So that's the reason why actually we have twofold. One aspect, which is collecting large quantity of data. It's important. The second one is really smaller but high quality. So we have the two angles, and the large language model has basically shown that. I mean, you need to get a huge corpus in order to really get the semantic content of the data. And second one, and that's where also is the high value of the language data space, is to really have small, very curated data sets, so that they are actually valuable in order to adapt the different models that are going to be built. So both. But
Aidan,
at
I
least
don't know.
a smaller part of data, please.
Aidan, I don't know if you wanted to add something about quality, the quality of data.
Just a little bit. I think that's a really important point, particularly when we start looking at our high-value data sets. Like in a data space, I believe, a personal view is that we're going to have high-quality data, we're going to have medium-quality data, and then we're going to have the rest. And all of that data is useful in different circumstances. You know, so if you're making mission-critical, life-critical decisions, you want to be using high-quality data that you trust. If you're doing things like customer satisfaction, you know, maybe that medium quality and that other types of data, sure, that could form part of it. So I think it becomes really important to think about it in terms of what kind of decision are we making, what data are we using, and does the data space help us understand the quality of that data that we're using, so that if we are using low quality data for a very important decision, we know that, and that maybe says, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't make this decision using this data at this time. So I think that's a really important thing about the trust that we have in data. The other thing to consider here is the notion of subjectivity, because my high quality data could be somebody else's low quality data. And we have to recognize that people will have different perspectives, different views, and different interpretations of what's high versus low quality. So there's that notion of subjectivity is something that we need to bring into the data quality conversation as well, and to understand what that means, because a data space is fundamentally decentralized. There's lots of participants. And once we decentralize it, we'll have subjectivity and different perspectives coming from different parts of the community.
If I can jump on this one, it's actually evaluation is a key angle there. To really, and it's one of the really key aspects of the data space, standardization of the evaluation process, so that everybody can speak the same language in terms of the quality that all the different data and for the needs as well.
Well, indeed, I was going to say those questions are actually coming in as you're speaking. You're answering them even before our audience is getting them written down, which was, is there a common accepted concept of data quality? And indeed, bad quality is better than no data, but how do we make sure this doesn't affect outcomes? So very much speaking to what you're actually already answering and taking forward the conversation. But there has been a question that's been sitting here for a while asking, do we really need to create new standards to make the idea of data spaces work? It's a very overarching question, so I don't know who wants to tackle it at this late stage.
Well, Francesco, with his experience of data analysts, might have a view there.
Well, about the need of creating standard, I would say,
or using existing standard.
Or using existing, I mean, everybody adopting the same standard. I think this question has been somehow touched upon earlier, but I think it's a fundamental aspect of data space. As I said, within the same data space, but also across data space. I think adopting standard, we talked about vocabulary, lexicon, taxonomies, ontologies that can communicate, that can connect with each other. Well, I think it's unavoidable. And to be honest, well, I think that in this Anders perspective, I'm a bit optimistic in the sense that in 2023, the technology is actually on our side. And as Marc Christopher was mentioning before, by using certain standards and certain, I would say, technology, we were able to easily connect different data sources. So I think the main challenge is really from, I would say, from Edward's perspective, as he was saying before, making this kind of consensus that is more, I would say, more than a technical challenge, is more, I would say, kind of organizational challenge. But in terms of adopting standard, I tend to believe the fact that it's essentially crucial and very important.
So, Edward, we do not need to develop new standards, do we?
So what I would say is I think it's probably very important for us to understand how the current standards can help us deliver a data space. I think that's definitely the first step. And some of those standards will be formal standards. Some of them are de facto standards that people that are just accepted. So I think that's the first step. The next step, which the SSE will work on as well, would be trying to understand, well, how can those standards be integrated? How do they work together to give us a workable solution? Because there's lots of standards from different areas that could be part of the problem. And then I think the question is, well, are there gaps that are there? And to identify those gaps, because difficult to standardize everything, especially something as complex as a data space. So at points we'll have key standardizations that enable a lot of things, and I believe that there's been significant work in that space that we can leverage those, and then we need to figure out what's going to be de facto or what's going to be specific to a particular industrial sector or a particular industrial data space. From a personal point of view, I believe what we need is the minimal amount of standards possible that makes this work. So it's not about, again, it's personal view. We don't want to standardize absolutely everything, because every standard that we introduce or bring in is potentially a barrier to entry, because we have to conform to that standard. What we need is, what's the minimum that we need to make this work, to keep it as simple as we possibly can, while still recognizing this is very complex. This is not something easy. And I think a good metaphor for us to think about there is to look at the web. A good example, like the web itself has very, very simple standards at its heart, and it's actually been able to achieve amazing things in terms of interoperability and sharing of documents, etc., online. So thinking about that kind of KISS principle, keeping it very, very simple, and understanding, well, we have to standardize this far but no further, because that's all we need to make a data space interoperable and to make it usable by its community.
We have a question on taxonomy interoperability, asking if each ecosystem uses its own, do we then go back to the same data integration issues?
Edward, go back.
Yeah. So the Dijkstra has a famous quote that all problems in computer science can be solved by another layer of abstraction. So you keep building more and more layers, and that could be a truism as well within data. I think one of the things that's different here with data spaces is the scale of the endeavor that we're looking at. Means that if we can bring together, for example, procurement, if we're bringing together all the public procurement within Europe at that scale, that's a large community. And sure, will there be additional needs for linking those taxonomies and vocabularies to other communities? Yes, but by having the scale of these data spaces, I think we can simplify that process a little bit, so that we do have critical mass in each of those different areas. But this goes back to this notion of consensus building and ensuring that we can do this in an incremental manner, so that we're not trying to have full consensus across everything at the start, but recognizing that we want to build that slowly over time. And that will mean that there will be new data spaces that we haven't even thought about today that will need new vocabularies, that will need new taxonomies, and we'll have to figure out, well, how do we interoperate with that? How do we connect and be able to share our data with them as well? For example, if you were thinking a decade ago about data, we wouldn't be talking about the large quantities of multimedia data that we have now, the large repositories of language data that we have. These are new types of data, new quantities of data that we're dealing with. So I think we need to think about interoperability as a journey. It's not a destination. It's not like today the world is interoperable, everything works together. That's not the way we are. We're in a race with the technologies that we create as a society, because we're always creating more data, we're creating more interesting data, new sources of data, and we always need to figure out, how do we bring that in to our data spaces? How do we connect with that data, make it easier to reuse, make it easier for people to be able to leverage it and to use it inside their processes and their businesses.
So someone here is saying the Publications Office in person took on board the principles of semantic data and focused on publishing data in SKOS. Will the other institutions go in the same direction? I'm not asking anyone to speak for all institutions, but if anyone, yeah, Mark, Christopher.
We're using them.
You're using it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Another specific question, are there any reference applications proposed to put at the core of building data spaces?
I don't know if someone has an answer to that. Reference application, no, but I think that Francesco already mentioned, if I've understood the question, mentioned that there is actually a public procurement that has been recently published for the creation of what is a technical infrastructure for creating data spaces, which is named Simple, where the Commission is going to procure the creation of this data infrastructure in terms of open source middleware software that then will be distributed to made available as open source. So I don't know if I'm answering the right question, but I don't know if someone else wants to add something about it.
Well, I think we're getting towards the end of our questions here.
Yeah.
It's been an in-depth conversation. I think we've certainly asked a lot and you've answered a lot. So I'm going to take our last two questions together and maybe let all of you have an opportunity. So there seems to be questions about actions have been taken at EU level. How can member states be involved? Are member states involved in the process? And then what can an institution do if they want to become active in a data space? More specifically, if we want to get involved in the procurement data space. But basically, if I could hear from you, what are the next levels of involvement and how can different institutions or even different national institutions get involved?
Okay, let's start with Marc. And how can institutions get involved in the public procurement data space?
We are already in touch with some member states. I didn't mention it before, tomorrow we will publish a communication on the public procurement data space. It will be available, I hope, tomorrow afternoon, which explains a little bit more the concepts about the public procurement data space, but it also has specific information that is relevant for the member states who are interested to join the public procurement data space so that they are getting ready to join. We will help them in the future to connect their national data portals to connect to the public procurement data space. And it will be in a collaborative approach. It's not something that we will do just on our side, but we will actually be very, very active with the member states who want to join the public procurement data space. We will set up a governance framework, which is very, very important. We will work on MOUs, so when member states want to participate, that we have an agreement together on what kind of information do we get and who can use the data. So from our side, it will be in the coming months very active in the collaboration with the member states.
Philippe, then, yes, exactly.
Yeah, for the member state, there is two aspects here. One aspect is actually that the support of the overall operation, the digital program, is not a commission decision. Yes, it's a commission decision actually, but it's built with the support of the other member state in synchronization with the member state. Okay, so that's an important aspect. So the second one is actually the fact that data spaces need to be open to everybody, to every actor. So first and second, all the member states are definitely welcome in this exercise. For our specific case, we have foreseen, and specific because language, when you talk about the different language, the 24 official languages and the like, member states are hypersensitive in this exercise. So we have established already before, but we will do exactly the same for the language data space. Member state expert group, if you want, member state liaison, in order to be sure that all the different member states are represented in this endeavor. So it's really crucial in order to ensure that it's not only a EU institution exercise things, but it's really go beyond, so and leverage on all the different member states. And I remind also the fact that it's also the private sector. And the private sectors is an important factor. So we are really targeting and trying to build a real European Union marketplace of data with all the potential actors.
Edward, what is the Data Space Support Center again trying to involve or facilitate access to the data spaces that you are following?
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are interested in participating and understanding what data spaces are, getting more information, a great place to go is the Data Space Support Center website, dssc.eu. If you go there, you'll see we have a starter kit, and the purpose of this starter kit is to be the entry point into the world of data spaces, to kind of give people access to the resources and to help them understand what a data space is and what are the challenges that are there. Starter kit is structured along what we call the BLOF framework. So it's business, legal, operational, functional, and technology concerns. So it's an overview that kind of gives It gives somebody new to data spaces an idea of what are the challenges that are there, what are the different dimensions that need to be tackled. It also has a very extensive list of the existing resources that are available there. I'm happy to say that at our symposium next week, we'll actually officially launch the first version, the 1.0 version of our starter kit. It's currently available on our website as an interim version, but at our symposium next week, we'll launch the first version of it. And I'd also say that the community of practice, then once you've figured out what a data space is and you want to learn more and engage with the community of practice from the DSSC will also be a good place to be able to interact with like-minded individuals. If you're a little bit more advanced, or if you're from a particular sector that there's a proprietary CSA in place, I'd very much encourage you to reach out to those CSAs as well. So they're in the areas of like manufacturing, Green Deal, mobility, energy. Each of those CSAs are also bringing together the communities, the organizations that are interested in establishing a data space in that area. Even if you're not an expert in that area, I would strongly encourage you, if you're interested in data spaces and you think your organization will want to engage with them in the future, engage with those CSAs, become part of the conversation, understand what's happening there, and make sure that your voice is heard as they're starting to put together the proprietary work that's needed to establish those data spaces. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to be able to engage the DSSC and also those proprietary CSAs.
Well, I think we've reached the end of the questions. I think that that our audience had wanted you all to answer. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Federico, I guess I will let you do a quick wrap up if you want a final comment before we say goodbye to our speakers.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much to all of you. And I think you have seen and you notice how there is a lot of enthusiasm in the creation of the data spaces, not only on the two ones that we've presented, but also the other one that are building up through the coordination support action that we are supporting, and that is funding under the Digital Europe program. But there is really a community that is building up and pushing towards organization that wants to share data, organization that wants to access the data. There are many challenges. The one that has been mentioned, I do not want to mention them again, but there is the issues of interoperability, standards, semantics, in order to be able to access the data and understand what the data means. But there is also the issue of trust. If I'm sharing the data, I want to know to whom I'm going to share the data and for which purpose is going to use the data. So I think it's something that it's starting, that we are building together with all the various stakeholders. And I think that for the people that wants to get interested, there is plenty of possibility. You can talk to the Commission directly. So for example, to DGIT, to DG-CNECT, that is bringing forward this idea. But you can also approach, as I was saying, the Data Spaces Support Center and the various coordination support action of several data spaces. So I think that you've got plenty of occasion, and I hope that we'll be able to give you a flavor of what is going on. And with that, I finish, and I'll thank you very much, everybody, that for your interest and all the questions that you sent us.
And thank you very much indeed, Francesco, Edward, Philippe, and Marc, Christopher, and Federico. I know we have you again tomorrow joining us, so we will presumably have more questions for you then as well.